everybody hear Reba in the back?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Anyway, I'm the current treasurer of the Friends of the San Jacinto Mountain County Parks. I met Stephen when I came over and joined the group. In addition to the Friends, Stephen is involved in other local nonprofits. He belongs to the Garden Club, and he also belongs to the Idlewild Historical Society. Stephen is a part-time resident here on the mountain, and he's known for his notorious pump house. Stephen is a realtor and the owner of Idlewild Experiences. He's a nature lover, and of course he loves history. Last year we met up at Four Corners in Fern Valley and walked all the way down to town, and he expounded the whole way on Idlewild and its past history. And please join me and welcome Stephen today.
Thank you, Reba. I think we all here share a common interest, don't we? I want to thank Sunny, because had it not been for Sunny, and calling me and saying, do you think you could give a little speech about VMAX, because he seems to have a lot of interest here. And he founded the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks, after all. So I said, sure, let's do a little digging. And I wanted to give a special call out to Bob, I don't know where he is, there he is, who has been very patient with me as I dug through the Idlewild Area Historical Society archives and bags and bags and boxes of material. So thank you to those two people who, were it not for them, this would not be possible. So thank you. So we're called together today to celebrate a guy that I think we all know and love, right? Mr. Idlewild himself, Ernie Maxwell, which many people call Emax, and we'll talk about where that name came from. And we'll talk about why Emax was so transformational in changing Idlewild as we know it today. And I think that's really important to show his whole life, starting with where he was born all the way through 1994, where he died in Hemet shortly after moving there from emphysema. So we're going to cover the whole life, but at the end, first of all, I'm going to ask, Ernie died in 1994. Are we fortunate enough to have anyone in here that met Ernie Maxwell? Reba, excellent, fabulous.
At the post office.
Where Ernie was famous to hang out, because guess what? That's where he found out where all the news was coming from, right? You had to be at the local post office to figure that out, didn't you? So we'll talk about that. So as we talk today, please add your stories. I have several things I've picked out to read and asked a few people from the audience to read, because Ernie was not only a prolific artist, he was a prolific writer, right? Poetry. Not only this, which he did for 25 years, right? But poetry and guides, and we'll talk about all of that. But Ernie started in a very unusual place, didn't he? Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where before Ernie was 7 years old, he had made 5 trips across the Atlantic. This was very unusual for a child born in 1911. And by the way, we share something very special, Ernie and I, the same birthday. We were both born on July 7th. Ernie was born in 1911, but he crossed the Pacific numerous times with his family who were missionaries, okay? And so once he landed, he finally decided he wanted an art career. He went to a junior college in Sacramento before finally deciding that art was his calling. And so off he went to UC Berkeley, where he graduated with a fine arts degree. And what fine art it was, he was an editor for the Daily Californian. The Daily Californian not only serves the campus of Berkeley, but it also serves the community of Berkeley, where he did several drawings. I like, in that time, my favorite is his self-portrait. There were at least 5, Fraser may correct me, and maybe more self-portraits, but I've seen 5 throughout his lifetime, and then toward the end I'll share all of those with you. But it's kind of an interesting self-portrait, isn't it? But then the war came, right? And Ernie was called to duty. So he enlisted. But guess what? They found Ernie's talent to be the drawing, of course. And he set out drawing, right? After meeting Betty, by the way, Betty was in the war too, okay? And Betty served as a nurse in the war. But you see these pictures that begin to emerge, and this is when Emacs emerges, okay? By the way, Betty, okay, was also called Bemax prior to moving to Idlewild because she was a Hollywood star. And they had named her Bemax before Ernie even collected the title of Emacs. That's where he kind of got the idea to start Emacs. And so what do we notice about these very unique drawings? Well, you see, back in the day, the San Jacinto Mountains were very important geologically, and they were important for the war effort. Why? We had mountains where we could see inbound aircraft. And Ernie's job was to differentiate those aircraft so that those young men could tell the difference between a Japanese plane or a German plane, okay, or a friendly Allied plane. And so he began to draw. And that's where all of his images became famous. You see how these differ a little bit, right? He was drawing a different. And these we have many, many, many copies of. But also not just determining where the enemy's aircraft carried, but also Ernie, and I'll leave these for you to do after, was on a conservation campaign. That started also at a very young age, where Ernie was tasked to draw for the young boys conservation efforts to help with the war efforts. We needed to conserve, right? Clean as you go, keep your tools sharp. He used all of his talents in the kitchen, drawing some fabulous things. And so you saw his artwork everywhere, okay? This, we see at the bottom, SAAAV. Anybody know what that stands for? It's in the bottom of everything, look. Santa Ana Air Force Air Base, okay? That's where the majority of people, in fact, a third of Costa Mesa was military at the time. It was taken up of all people. He was stationed in Douglas, Arizona, but he, for a while, oh, this is a good one, continued to draw, okay, and really create some fabulous stuff. But let's go back. I want you to read first how he discovered Idlewild, because I think this is important, because they left, the war was over, okay, and they did not like living in the city. Betty and Ernie wanted to escape Hollywood, to escape the life that they had. And so, please, this, by the way, was an excerpt taken from Betty's memoirs. So prior to Betty dying, okay, she wrote a memoir, and the memoir was about their discovery of Idlewild. Yes, stand up, and if you could, read this for us, please.
Living a mile high in a mountain town in Southern California is a far cry from the days in the Bennett Drama Department when Mildred Natwick and I were aspiring actresses. But there's more drama packed into 24 hours of editing a mountain newspaper than I ever experienced on Broadway. It all depends on where you sit. It was in 1945, just after my husband was discharged from the Army Air Force, that we decided the time had come to make a break from our Hollywood surroundings and try our hand at high altitude living. Idlewild was an unspoiled mountain village set in a fairy tale forest of pine and cedar of approximately 250 inhabitants and surrounded by mountains towering 10,000 feet above the valley. It hosted a healthy tourist season in the summer and then closed down to quieter pursuits through the winter. We have visited here at various seasons of the year and liked the invigorating change of seasons after the bland sameness of Southern California climate. Our plan was to build a cabin and settle down to freelance writing and drawing, a natural for my husband, who, before the war interrupted, was a cartoonist for a national magazine. Almost immediately, the picture changed. Building our own cabin proved to be hilarious, harrowing, and distinctly educational. It was the post-war era of acute shortages, and we scoured a 100-mile area for building materials of doubtful quality. We called a day well spent if we could scrounge a pound of nails. We moved in as soon as it was habitable, with a yawning where the fireplace was to be, and shared the house with bats, chipmunks, field mice, and an occasional bird sashaying among the rafters. There were trails to climb and deer and squirrels to befriend. One evening, around our hearth, neighbors suggested we could perform a community service by starting a little newspaper. The only way anyone knew what was happening in those days was by a poster or a notice tacked on the bulletin board at the post office.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Right. So that gives us some idea of what they faced moving here. Yes?
Maybe someone get a copy of that book?
Yes, that is not a book. That is a 5-page memoir that she
Just
wrote.
5 pages?
But I do have copies of it. You can email me, absolutely. So it began with camping trips, right? They began to explore the San Jacinto Mountains. He had already learned about the San Jacinto Mountains and their significance. Why? He knew that they had to come up here to look for enemy aircraft. He knew what happened when Grover Cleveland, the first time in the history of the United States, on February 22nd of 1897, said, these are off limits. You can no longer the first forest preserve, right? Okay? And just prior to that, remember, September 1896, when John Muir reached the top of Mount San Jacinto, what did he say, John King? He said, the most sublime spectacle to be found on the face of this earth is the top of Mount San Jacinto. Why would he say that? Because this was before the Industrial Revolution. The air was crystal clear. You could look far east across the Salton Sea. You could look all the way north to his beloved Yosemite. You could look all the way west across the Cleveland National Forest, wasn't even called that then, and the Pacific to see the Santa Catalina Islands, and all the way south to Mexico. It was the most sublime spectacle to be found on the face of this earth. Ernie knew it. Many people here knew that, right? And it was to be protected. And so that was his thought. You know, I'm coming here to do that. And when he bought his 3/4 of an acre, some of you may know where that is, right, on San Jacinto. You know where Ernie used to live with his little, at 55170 San Jacinto. Have you seen it? She lives right next door, she told me. She's seen it, right? But imagine this, folks. I'm a realtor, you know how much I love this. So for $650, he buys 3/4 of an acre in 1944. And they commenced building, as you heard, right? One piece at a time as they pieced it together. But Fern Valley was truly a sea of ferns at that time, okay? It was all ferns until it was destroyed by our lumber barons that we know and love so much. But look at dear Ernie, always typically with a pipe in his hand, and Betty there during a major snowstorm during one of their first years at the house that they built in the back. Isn't that plan? But did you hear what she said? Our plan was to just build a cabin and settle down and do some freelance writing and drawing, right? That was their goal. And certainly, that is what they did, isn't it? So they wanted to draw in privacy. He said there was one thing they had to have here, and that was a post office. Because he had to be able to still mail his artwork. You see, he was still drawing for Esquire, the New Yorker magazine. He still had drawings in the works. And so in 1945, or excuse me, in the Halloween actually was the date. Okay, so Halloween night, they had been out doing a little party, and their friends said they needed a little newspaper to start in Idlewild because nobody knew what was going on, right? And so they commenced printing. So the very first edition, I guess I should say, the very first edition of the Town Crier came off of this machine. A hand-cranked mimeograph, where Ernie produced 200 copies. Right here it is, okay? And they continued doing that. First every 2 weeks, then in the summer every week. And it continued. Ernie and Betty, as a team, wrote, draw, did everything. Where's my clicker? This is my bad, who's gonna watch my clicker for me? Thank you. This is my bad habit. I wander around and talking, and then I lose my clicker, right? So, look at where most of the action happened. You guys know where the town crier used to be, right? Where is that? Tell me. Right. That market has sort of taken over, and it's an Airbnb now, but it's that tiny little place next to where the Creekstone is, right next door. That cute little place. That was the town crier for many, many years. But also, walking distance, right, to San Jacinto Road, they could just walk down the road. But for the first few years during those snowstorms, it wasn't easy. Because this quickly became not very feasible. This became very problematic. So they had to go down to Hemet, to a ranch in Hemet, to print the newspaper until they could afford to buy one. Okay, it was the same ranch that did the Pomona pageant. So they would often be there with cowboys who were doing, Ramona pageant, you know, where they would do all that. And so he would go down there and do that. So it's really kind of interesting. But here's what he said. He called Palm Springs newspapers routinely referred to Idlewild as Upper Palm Springs. So Emacs consistently referred to them as Lower Idlewild. Something to be looked down on. But the first issue came out, right, November 1st, 1946. Some interesting things just on the front page that we can see in this. First of all, the largest chamber of commerce in Riverside County. Well, now that's interesting, isn't it? Don't forget, Riverside was the richest zip code in North America at the turn of the century. But this was 50 years later. So, you know, still kind of interesting. Also what's interesting is that for the first time ever, representatives from Pine Cove Mountain Center will be chosen for our trustees. Okay, so inclusive. We're going to bring everybody into the mix here. But you can see the common list of characters that you might recognize. Dear Rollin Humber, selling real estate up in Fern Valley, right? And Ernest Maxwell. But what did Ernest Maxwell call himself? A cartoonist and an illustrator. Because you see, he was on the list to be nominated, which he was, to the Board of Trustees, okay? One of his first titles of many in Idlewild. But what's significant here that you should realize is your time in history. What happened in Idlewild in May of 1945? The war ended in prior to that. But what happened in Idlewild?
The inn burned down.
Historians here should know this one. The Idlewild Inn burned to the ground.
I know.
Okay? They set up for temporary amusement park in the center of town to try to, you know, pacify people's spirits because everybody was so distraught over the burning of Idlewild Inn. Okay? This newspaper started in November 1st. In December, Town Hall was built, right? Remember that? Closed Town Hall. Guess who the main instigator of that was? Our very own Ernie Maxwell. And then the Desert Sun and Isomato were formed, all within a year. Fascinating, right? All happening right here. And the catalyst for all of that? No. Right. So Ernie spent many days in their living room from a fireplace that they had hauled stones from the local mountains. And you can see a little glimpse of it over there on the side of it, but better in the other article. But what I particularly enjoy is the illustrations, which, folks, that box was filled, and I went through almost every edition of the Town Crier, okay? What you have to realize is that, first of all, this was typewritten, okay? We have the typewriter at the Idlewild Area Historical Society. Is that right, Bob? Is that the typewriter that's there? I think so, yeah. That's right. So we have the original typewriter, the original mimeograph. That's hard work. Anybody remember typing with a manual typewriter? I'm old enough to remember that, okay? Hard work. And he drew every advertisement, which meant that every week when meat prices changed and dairy prices changed and the local market had different things, guess what? New ad, new drawing, okay? And so every single drawing was unique, which to me is fascinating. But remember what he called himself, right? Self-described cartoonist and illustrator, right? So, and that is what he loved more than anything else. And so what were the topics? Remember, almost all of the news part of the time. It's something that continues to this day in the town crier, right? But he had Zeke's Almanac, which was kind of fun, right? And this is where really Ernie's humor came into effect, because anybody that knew him would say he had an infectious sense of humor. And Zeke is one way he shows that sense of humor. There was always something fun, right, in that. And we had the weather, always on the front page. Ernie was masterful at charting the weather, okay? And he would give John King a run for his money with all of his weather stats and all of that kind of thing. Really fascinating. Every town crier was a different color, right? A different, almost all the news part of the time. And so you would have little snippets about what's happening in Idlewild. Almost all the news part of the time, right? A newcomer to the Hill is Hugh White, who's moved his family up for permanent residence. Mr. White is Western States Representative for Velvet Power of Indiana. I'm from Indiana, so I loved that one. He handles an internal hot flush for automobile engines. Came all the way from Idlewild, settled here, was in the town crier, right? So all the news that was fit to print, right? And then some. But what I find fascinating is whenever he had any space to fill, it was a drawing, okay? If there wasn't news, okay, if there wasn't partly news to fill, he filled it with a drawing. And what I also find fascinating are what we see inside the town crier. So, I gave, let's see, I forget who I gave, yes, Jeff, I think I gave you this one. Because every town crier was featuring what was called a woodland journal. And this was Ernie's way of calling attention to nature. Jeff?
A couple of our readers have reminded us that we promised to carry on with our series of articles about natural life in the San Jacinto Mountains. Unfortunately, we haven't always spaced for everything, and the flora and fauna have been sacrificed for human doings. This week, however, we're giving the birds precedence over people. Since more than 169 varieties of birds have visited these mountains at one time or another during the past 50 years, it is impossible to cover the field completely. Nevertheless, if any of our readers care to investigate the local bird life, we invite them to spend the next few years equipped with boots, field glasses, and reference books here on the Hill. Of the 169 species spotted, some are now extinct or no longer list the San Jacinto Mountains as a stopover. The California condor used to perch on the high cliffs overlooking the desert. A family of them was observed years ago at the head of Snow Creek. However, poison meat set out for bear liquidated the condor colony.
Thank you. Calling attention to our environmental atrocities, right? And it didn't stop there. Of course, whenever there was breaking news, it called for an extra edition, right? When things happened in town that had to be told between, you know, the 2 weeks or 1 week, and this was the extra when what happened? Now it can be told. Rumors have been flying, and the sale of the Idlewild Mountain Inn is final. We have approached the town crier deadlines for the last 3 issues with our noses into the wind, eagerly sniffing for the go-ahead signal. At last it has come. And we feel the news of the sale of the Idlewild Inn to the Idlewild Arts Foundation is of significant importance to the Hill folk to merit this special edition. The purchase was made for Bob O'Donnell and Thomas Hearn, who bought the property in 1947. Final papers were signed, $150,000 transaction. And they bought 11 acres and 11 cabins surrounding them. So whenever there was breaking news, it came out again, right, for some more telling. And extras came out often, okay, as breaking news happened in Idlewild. One of the things that is particularly interesting to me, and maybe some of you can shed some light on this for me that may have known Ernie, is how they shifted. So from 1946, right, to well, the end, so 1947, until 1949, okay, it was a fairly traditional header. Zeke was on the front, you always had the weather, services, whatever. Then came 1950. And with reckless abandon, he began to draw, okay? And every single episode, I keep saying episodes like I'm talking about a series, right? Every single edition, thank you, was different and had different artwork on the front. This, to me, is fascinating because this went on for a decade. Look at this table. Look at this box. It's full of town criers that are original drawings that Ernie did. And no longer news on the front page. There was news on the following page, but his artwork became first and foremost on the front page. No longer was he publishing in Esquire, New Yorker, etc. This became, in my mind, his primary, and he wanted to make sure his art wasn't lost, I think, in advertising and other, small little pieces that he did here multiple times in every single edition of the Town Crier.
So it's no longer one page? Was it always one page?
No, it was only one page a very short time. It became 3 to 7 pages very quickly. Yeah. And, but there were seasonals covers, right? Spring, Easter, whatever happened during the holidays. If there was a special event, the Lions Club had a fish fry, was on the front page of, he would draw it, okay? So the drawing became the center of attention for decades. You see the difference? Going from just 1949 to all the years of the 50s, which I find really fascinating. But also, Ernie did not just spend time, see what I did? You guys watching me? You're watching me. Christmas episode, right? I love it. I love that. But he wasn't just involved in the newspaper. That was his life, by the way. 24 hours a day, it seemed like, 7 days a week. I don't know, it would have taken me that much time to do all of that, but he didn't stop there. The Isaac Walton League was formed in December of 1948. Remember the Town Crier started in 46, right? So it's only a couple of years later, he must have had some extra time on his hands. And he thought, well, it's time to start an Isaac Walton League. And why did he do that? Could you read this aloud for me, Bob, please?
It has waged numerous battles to protect the wilderness area of the San Jacinto Mountains, the natural resources of this region. It has helped plant thousands of seedlings, trout in streams, and assisted with habitat improvement.
And that was the foundation of the Isaac Walton League, which, by the way, broke away from California some years later. Originally, it was a conservation organization. Then it became a hunting organization in California, not in the rest of the United States. And so their chapters sort of became different than the rest of, the rest of the Isaac Walton League became more similar to sort of the Sierra Club, right? But here, it was a hunting club. And Ernie didn't, so much appreciate that. And we're going to talk about the forming of the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks several years later. But for the Isaac Walton League, he began, and he said things that I just love in the Town Crier as he began his episodes here. And I've asked Bronwyn to read one of my favorite Woodland journals, which was about beavers, one of his main callings.
There's nothing quite like a day with a bunch of beavers. Although they never become very friendly, you find yourself getting strangely attached to them. You learn to respect their detached manner and their attached teeth and claws. Last Saturday, we had a chance to observe the reaction of 9 beavers at close range. We helped pack them into the backcountry where the colony is going to set up housekeeping. Eventually, the beaver dams will provide a series of deep pools for rainbow and golden trout. In addition, the work of the beavers will arrest erosion in the vicinity of the stream. Beavers, we discovered, are quiet little creatures. They only sound off when they're mad or given an alarm. When they don't want you around, they utter a low growl that sounds like a bad cold. In sounding the alarm, the sentinel beaver dives into the water, spanking the surface with his flat tail, a report like a rifle. Loading the beavers on the pack animals at the stables gave us some apprehension. Brought from Merced County, they had traveled via truck and a tank all night. The mules shied suspiciously as the watered-down beavers were put in cages and loaded aboard. Because beavers are aquatic, they must be kept in a cool, moist place. As many of our readers know, the Devil's Slide Trail is not blessed with gushing streams every half-mile. Jolly Springs is completely dry, and it wasn't until we hit the boggy spot above it that we were able to water down the precious cargo. A couple of them appeared groggy, but a dash of cold mountain water set an ear to wheeling and a rolling eye.
Thank you, Brian. So why beavers? What was his fascination for beavers? Did anybody see the LA Times article 2 weeks ago about beavers front page? Yes, it's made its way around the news. Guess what they're discovering now? Areas of wildfire, significant wildfire damage, where there's beaver infestation, stops the wildfire. Why? Because they build these massive tunnels of water. Okay, and so when the fire comes through and it hits that massive marsh, it stops. Okay? And so he was able to convince people of the Isaac Walton League that it was important. Why? Because of fishing. So they could dam the creeks, put in beavers to help with the future damming. They didn't survive. There wasn't enough water anymore. And they had cleared the mountain, don't forget, of all the forest. So creating a much drier environment than it used to have. And men killed all the beavers for their pelts. Okay? So there were no beavers left. It was Ernie's intent to bring them back. He was way ahead of his time. Okay? This article in the LA Times, 2024. We were in 1949. Okay? So way ahead of his time. 75 years, in fact, ahead of his time. But they didn't stop with beavers. No. Tree planting was a massive effort that spanned many, many years of his life. Trees at the school. Trees planting up in the high country. Trees for conservation efforts around the mountains. And so for years they spent planting trees. And Ernie and Betty did a lot of that in their volunteer spare time, right? But in 1951, Ernie took to the high country. Why? The National Wildlife Federation had commissioned him to do a survey. Remember, the surveys that were done prior to this were 50 years old, because the prior surveys were prior to the turn of the century. So when Pinochet and all those people were doing all of their land surveys across the country and they came through the San Jacintos, it was the late 1800s. Okay? Now it was time for another survey. He wanted to survey what was going on with the wildlife and the beavers. Has anyone seen this, by the way? This national, did they make a documentary, and has anybody ever seen this? Because I couldn't find it. I didn't write them, but okay. I would love to get my hands on that 1951 documentary, so I'm going to try. But I don't know if anybody knows how we might be able to do that. I'd be really interested. to see a little bit of that. But his environmentalism really took its firmest focus against our beloved tram. Now remember, this was Crocker's Folly that started in 1935. So right after the Great Depression, they had great dreams at the bottom of Crocker Springs. Crocker Bank. Crocker was famous, and it was called Crocker's Folly after it failed, in fact. But their intent was to do what? Their intent was to have these lovely hotels down around the base of the mountain, right? And then they could haul people up for skiing. So they were going to produce a giant ski resort. Imagine Big Bear, Arrowhead. That was going to be the top of Mount San Jacinto. And guess what? Ernie, over my dead body, right? He wasn't going to have that. I was always at the courthouse seeking an injunction to stop it, right? That's what he spent a lot of his life doing. And he tried to stop it. He did not stop it, but what he did manage to do is thwart its distance. It didn't go all the way up into the high country as it was supposed to. And when you got off, you couldn't hike very far before you were in pristine wilderness land that could not be touched. So there would not be any development at the top of Mount San Jacinto, right? But they managed to do it. And of course, there's our beloved Pat Brown right in the front of the car, riding to the top of the tram in 1963 when the tram opened, okay? But this was sort of like Hetch Hetchy was to John Muir. This was Ernie's passion. They would not build a ski slope on the top of his mountain. No, it wouldn't happen, right? But nor did he consider it, by the way, the eighth wonder of the world. Okay? But his writings didn't stop. In fact, his writings continued prolifically. And we even saw poems that appeared from him. His drawings continued, right? His work with the Isaac Walton League continued. His writings continued, and in fact, the writings continued prolifically. He then began to turn his attention on brochures and pamphlets and ways, because now that this was open, now that we had a highway both sides of the mountain that came to Idlewild, we have to educate people on how to take care of these mountains. And so he began to produce. First it was under the name of Isaac Walton League, right? And in here, it wasn't just hikes, right? He had to tell you about Idlewild. Let me tell you a little bit about Idlewild, right? And the San Jacinto Mountains. And let me tell you about a little bit about the history of our place and our beloved sanatorium and all of that, right? He had to tell you a little bit about that. And of course, he had to tell you what animals, wildlife, everything about the San Jacinto Mountains in the simplest drawings so that children, adults, could understand exactly what that was. But his primary focus was stopping the sawmills. The sawmills, folks, did not stop. Emerson, okay? We know Emerson, right? Camp Emerson, all right? Not one of my favorite Idlewild figures, okay? Not a very nice man. He wanted to build an airstrip, a golf course, another lake. Really, development was his primary goal, okay? Not trying to maintain our pristine forest environment. And so Emerson was eventually run out of town. Thankfully, he went bankrupt and none of that stuff ever happened. But Emerson ran the sawmill in town. In fact, until power came in 1923, you had to rely on Emerson. And he shut it off at 10 o'clock because he didn't like any shenanigans going on after that. So his sawmill stopped, so did the electricity, okay? But through the 40s, they were sawing in Idlewild. And you may have noticed on some of those ads that I flipped past, there were lumber yards still up here in Idlewild, on private property. Is that what you were going to ask?
Yeah, because I was always under the impression that the logging stopped when Robert Friedland, a few years after he passed the preservation.
Government land, public land, yes. Private lands, where most of this was. When they bought the Idlewild Inn, they bought 2,000 acres. There was a lot of forest to cut down, okay? Fern Valley, when it sold, They sold 1,000 acres, okay? So he bought a bunch of that land. It was private land. You could do whatever you want. And so they could continue sawing. But Ernie was not happy about that, okay, at all. And you see his quotes everywhere. You know that San Jacinto's book that probably many of you have that we love? Talks about the devastation of the forest. Ernie Maxwell's quoted throughout that book. Absolutely. But I just love his simple depictions, you know, starting from the bottom, you know, the lowest elevation, going to the highest elevation, and the simplicity of his drawings and what you find in the forest and wildlife. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then, the unthinkable happened. The Idlewild Town Crier sold. Yep, to Marilyn and Luther Weir. Emacs continued drawing, still drew headlines, still drew, but his writing continued, a couple of articles, but in 1972, he sold. In 1957, by the way, he gave it up for 1 year, but he came back. Couldn't give it up for long, right? They traveled a minute, but it was too ingrained in his DNA. He couldn't give it up, right? And so, but the reason they gave it up in 1972, he was asked, why did you give it up after 25 years of producing it? Because we got tired of being stuck behind a desk. Which didn't look like to me he was stuck behind a desk too much, right? He was in the high country quite a bit on horseback. We know that. But then, on July 4th, 1977, he didn't rest for long. Because then, the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks was formed. Yes? The original incorporation of the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks, and whose signature is at the top? You know. You know who? Ernest Maxwell, right? So in 1977, the Visitor Center was just that. They had opened this highway, and the Visitor Center, this room we're sitting in, did not exist. It was only over there, okay? That main room is the only thing that existed, I think. And so, well, I know. And so what happened during that time is they had a major celebration, and Ernie was here for all of it. Ernie was here for his legendary Chalk Talks, which I would really be interested, of course they weren't filmed, but it would be interesting to hear from anyone who attended one of Ernie's Chalk Talks. Did anybody attend this session? First of all, was anyone here in 1977 for the opening of this visitor center? You were?
Since 72 I've been here.
Okay. Do you remember it?
No, I
Okay.
don't. I was probably 10, 11.
You can see there were still some interesting things. Even logging and woodcutting was still going on. Puppet shows were very popular. But what was most popular were Ernie Maxwell's Chalk Talks.
What did that consist of? What was a chalk talk?
A Chalk Talk was his way of sitting around. He would draw a picture, just like this, on a drawing board, and then he would discuss a topic. Always wildlife, usually the San Jacinto Mountains, something historical, and he would talk. But he drew hundreds of people to these Chalk Talks. In an article, let's see if I can find it because it's fascinating. It's here. I don't want to waste too much time, but I do have a fascinating article that he wrote. Oh yeah, here it is. So in 1981, he was interviewed, and they asked him about Chalk Talks. He said, I had done Chalk Talks in college as part of a routine and extension of my cartooning. I would just cartoon and tell a little story. It got to be really popular. I was in very high demand. Year-round, really. Someone would say, well, we haven't got anything else to do, so let Ernie give a Chalk Talk. We'd have it at the Idlewild Inn, or we'd have a party and a campfire program, a school function. It was always just seemed to be understood that a Chalk Talk would be part of any Idlewild gathering. I gave Chalk Talks for the county park campfire programs for 25 years. The reporter asked, Ernie, what was the biggest audience you ever had? Emacs said, we often had anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200 people in the summertime. You see, there was no television. When I took the census in 1950, by the way, right after he came here, he was the census taker. When I took the census in 1950, I think I tallied up 4 TV sets in the entire town of Idlewild. So everyone had to come out on Saturday night to see my campfire programs. There was nothing else to do. So this was a big event in 1977. Ranger Bob Mott, that was your predecessor back in 1977. Ranger was here for a number of years. He was legendary in town. And it was really quite fascinating. But what's fascinating about this particular date is what happened right after, which was Betty, who passed away.
Wow.
Right. And so this is the foreword of what you read from earlier, okay, where she was writing about her life. Okay, she never finished that. That's why it's only 5 pages in length. But here's what he said about her. Could you read this aloud, Megan, please?
As trees shed their colorful foliage, we do not despair. Long ago we discovered that after winter passed, buds return and new leaves form. Nature has convinced us that life there is not beginning or end, is no beginning or end.
So, just a few months later, March 1st, 1978, how long was that? She died in August of 1977. He's still at it. He hasn't stopped, right? And he's not going to, right? So this was his way of combating the Isaac Walton League. If, in fact, they weren't going to protect nature, we should, right? And so he began a prolific career in the 1980s of drawing and writing and drawing and writing and drawing. And so one of my favorites is this. You've seen this, right? Some of you long-timers, you've seen this before. It's not that old, okay? This was his almanac that he produced the first one of in 1984. And in 1984, he told about the lore of the San Jacinto Mountains. And this is a pretty good-sized little book here. Okay, he had lots of drawings in here too. He had lots of history in here too. But what this was mainly written about is just talking about the San Jacinto Mountains. Okay, and he began talking about pine trees. He began talking about the forest. He wrote prolifically that, you know, never seemed to stop. And he also began to shift his focus from drawing. So, if you went to the archives, you know, where I've been sniffing around the last few weeks, you'll see a lot of artifacts of his. He began to focus on a more native approach, you know? He began to look, like this is a brochure, he opened an art gallery. Does anybody know the name of the lady that he opened the art gallery with? I don't remember. He was her muse, I believe, for a while. You see a lot of paintings. The lady with long dark hair, do you know who that is? I don't know either. I don't remember. But a resident of the San Jacinto Mountains in Southern California, Maxwell has spent the last 36 years living in Idlewild, where he has engaged in numerous pursuits. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. A professional cartoonist and illustrator before joining the U.S. Air Force in '42, he has since devoted more time to sculpting and writing. These ceramic sculptures indicate his interest in caricature and primitive art. He is especially drawn to the work of early African artists. Simplicity is important because it relates to nature. Ernie said, "When we look closely at nature, we see that nothing is wasted. There's a reason for everything. My many years living in a forest on the slopes of a distinctive mountain range have influenced my entire outlook."
How old was his wife when she died?
Shh, that's a good question. I don't remember. I would say her late 70s. I don't remember. And the self-portraits didn't stop, which I found really interesting. They came in quite fast succession after the 60s. Don't you think those are interesting? I love those, right? But his writings didn't stop. The brochures that would emerge with Ernie's name on them and nothing else. This is something I found in a garage sale. And if you look very closely at the bottom, what do you see? Who drew this? Emacs drew it, okay? And so everything you turned to had Ernie's footprint on it, okay? His handprint, if you will, not footprint. And this was just simply points of interest in the San Jacinto Mountains. It wasn't meant for any other purpose. And so was this. This first copy came in 1988. This was the pictorial history of the San Jacinto Mountains by none other than Ernie Maxwell, right? And this is all of the history you would ever want to know about the San Jacintos and then some. So Ernie was many things for many people, but there's no doubt that Ernie changed the life, of Idlewild as we know it today. Because do you know of another person that has been as prolific? Do you know another person that has changed a town, like that? And when you think about this guy and his titles, I just wrote down, every time I'd come across a new title, he'd call himself something, right? Because in the beginning, how he survived, he shoveled snow and cut wood, And then he started working for the Ranger Service for $1 a day, where he would go out and help with the trails, right? And then. So I know I've missed things. I know I didn't get all of his titles correct. But I would say that he also started to write a book that, can you imagine, was never published. He has many things that were, and it's similar, but he had begun a memoir of none other than a history of the San Jacinto Mountains. And of course, his history said that we don't want Idlewild to become another Big Bear. But his last words were that this may mean that the next decade will see wealth as a factor in the growth pattern of Idlewild. 10 years from now, this might be a place only for the wealthy. But because of ample space in public ownership, the hiker, the camper, the fisherman, the vacationer, they'll always be able to enjoy our mountains and forests. It's doubtful the general public will ever be denied access to these beautiful mountains. The burden for community leaders will increase competition as space heats up. Studies by the Forest Service indicate the San Bernardino Forest will continue to be the most heavily used national forest in the country. How to best satisfy the various needs will be a challenge not faced when fewer than 500 persons lived here year-round, right? So I'm just going to leave you with one thing, and that is probably one of my favorites. This came from his niece. Probably you guys may know Lori. Some of you may know Lori. I think this ended up in a box with some critters. But it was a fabulous edition. She had an extra copy, so she gave one to me. But this is the Town Crier episode when Ernie died. And this was the episode when they were interviewed. A number of people were interviewed. But my favorite quote comes from a man by the name of Holt. Does anybody know this gentleman, John Holt?
Yeah.
Yes.
Surveyor.
Yes, surveyor, and Isaac Walton League, and very close friend to Ernie for a number of years. Can you read this out loud for me?
Ernie was the personification of what we have in the mountain wilderness, the concept of the forest, the concept of the state park. These are not new. It takes people like Ernie to bring it into being. That's going to be his heritage. potent concept of giving for all, for what we stand for, with no compensation expected.
Right. So that's the quote I leave you with today. Okay? What are you doing to help our mountains? Okay? This organization that you sit in, this Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks, is a glorious organization. Jeff is on the board, Reba sits as treasurer. I certainly help with volunteering efforts every opportunity that I get. If you are not members of the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks and you live here, that's shameful. Reba and Jeff will be glad to take your memberships at the back of that table after we leave. Or you can kindly put a small donation that will go to a very good cause for us here in Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks. Reba, what do the Friends do? And Jeff? Yes, go ahead. Yes. So let Reba talk a little bit about what the Friends does, or Jeff, or whoever wants to say that before we close.
I'll tell you about the last thing, one of the last things that Friends have done. As you came in to the Nature Center, did you see the bear?
Oh, yeah.
The Friends of the San Jacinto Mountain County Parks purchased that bear from Jay Johnson. It was residing on the Green Big Nursery downtown, but I spotted it down there and I thought that bear belongs at the Nature Center. So I came to the board meeting and gave them the best sales talks I could. So they went for it. They went down, they bought the bear, and they have now installed it here at the Nature Center. You can see it as you drive by. And so that's one of the things that the Friends do to help support and promote the Nature Center.
We have 5 events coming up. Wildflower Festival, is that the next one, guys? Yes, May 25th and 26th. For Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks, the Lemon Lily Festival, the Wildflower Festival, the Butterfly Days are all things that the Friends of San Jacinto Mountain County Parks. So we have those brochures ready for you to pick up. And that, folks, concludes our speech about Ernie Maxwell. Happy to take comments or questions from people that you may want to comment. Yeah.
I'm actually interested in Betty. So
Yes.
was she still in healthcare to some degree?
No, she actually was a metaphysical writer. And I'm not sure exactly, I read some of her writings, which were somewhat spiritual in nature, but not really. But I think she counseled people. I mean, that's the impression I got from reading. People who may have known them may know otherwise. Yeah, Bob.
She was a speaker also around and throughout the LA area. I forget the exact name of the spiritual organization, but she was one of the key founders and presenters. She spoke in LA, she spoke at conferences across the country. She was very well known and truly a fascinating person in her own right.
I asked because my children's pediatrician was a world-renowned osteopath. Her name was Viola Fryman.
Yes.
And she had her practice down at the little yellow house at the Cove in La Jolla. And she had mentioned that Betty, Ernie Maxwell's wife, was her colleague for 14 years. So I'm just wondering.
And that connection comes because Betty's father, was a very famous osteopath.
Oh.
Well known throughout the world.
Yes.
So that is probably where that
Yeah, they
connection-
both trained under, the doctor's name. They were one of the rare few, so they did the cranial sacral work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
So kind of some interesting connections.
Yeah, to tie into the History Museum, online on the History Museum, you can go and look at a number of artifacts, our newsletter, and we did one not too long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, about Betty and kind of her journey through life, through metaphysics, and we have a huge pile of her notes that she prepared to make her presentations, her playbills when she was performing both in college and then on stage. It's a fascinating bit of history for Idlewild.
Wow.
If you can check the artifacts, we're going to be loading a lot of more, or the website, we're going to load a lot more artifacts on because we're now putting them all together. But you might look for the one about Betty Maxwell. There's a lot of pretty good
Bob, didn't you write that article?
Yeah, I did. That's why I know
He's
it's
too modest. It's a really good one, you should read that. You should read that. Yeah,
So I just looked it up, and she was 71 when she died.
thank you, 71, good to know. Who else? Somebody had their hand up over here. Comments? Questions?
Just an internet, a lot of people may know this, but when I think the original totem pole went up where the monument is, I think it was Mr. Roy was the carver, but I'm not 100% sure.
Jonathan Le Benet.
Correct.
He's the first one.
Correct.
Jonathan Le Benet.
Okay.
That was made out of the tree that was in the middle of.
Right in the middle of the road. Well, Ernie was in that totem pole. And then he was carved into it. And an interesting side note was that I was driving around one day trying to get somewhere, and I accidentally turned down a dead end. And what they did with that totem pole when they were done, they cut it up into pieces, and I don't know if they auctioned it off or what. But there was a chunk of totem pole at this person's house that I had to back out of because I'd gone into a driveway. It was the chunk with Ernie's head.
I love that totem because it had his face and then his shoes with his hiking boots sticking out the bottom. By the way, the hiking boots, we didn't bring them for you to see today, but I would encourage you to come up and check out the artifacts that we've drug over here for you. Because his boots are over there, but also his original backpack that he used to climb the San Jacintos and they took into the high country, okay? And the original camera where he took many of his photographs is here. So there's some interesting little things up here. I think that if you haven't looked at these drawings, please, as you exit, take a moment to just reflect on what that would take for someone. How many pictures have you scanned, guys, of Ernie's?
Hundreds, on just his collection, one collection, and there's thousands to go.
Okay, so how many would you estimate you've scanned so far?
300 or 400 so far.
Pictures?
Of everything in Idlewild, daily life all across the board. He took pictures of the utility vehicles. He took pictures of events. He took pictures of people. He had several envelopes just of people in Idlewild at that time.
He was a reporter.
Yeah.
You know, he loved taking pictures. And those are photographs, not his drawings.
Right.
Folks, we don't even have these archived. We don't even have those saved digitally. There's hundreds, if not thousands of those. Yeah. Yes.
Tell us about the squirrel.
Tell us about the squirrel. That was his favorite character, and so that is now my favorite character. And so that has become my sort of logo, is the Idlewild, my business Idlewild experience. I use the strawberry and the significance of Strawberry Valley, where there once were wild strawberries that existed here that squirrels could eat. And so I just have, that's my little logo. Ernie loved drawing squirrels. I mean,
And the squirrels on the newspaper?
I mean, half of these are squirrels. You know, there's a squirrel in nearly every drawing of Ernie's, you know. And you've seen the little slow down and honk, those signs that are pervasive around town. Ernie. That's who you have, Ernie. Right.
I have questions.
Yes.
Are any of these little pamphlets, are they in print?
I don't think so. Bob, are any of those in print that you know of? Like the Emacs journals, this almanac and stuff? Any print of these?
They're out of print. We have several of the archives, but we haven't gone to reprint them.
You can find these around places.
But we could look into it.
We'll scan them.
in the States.
Yeah.
I found some on eBay too.
Yeah, you can find these around, because there were quite a few of these printed. So it's not such a collector's edition as some of the other artifacts I dug up. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Come up and mill around, look at Ernie's stuff. Thank you so much.
question. That was quite good.
Viola Fryman?